Let me introduce formally our guests for this afternoon. We'll start with Peter Doherty. He shared the 1996 Nobel Prize in Medicine for discovering the nature of cellular immune defence, and he continues to be involved in research directed at understanding and preventing the severe consequences of influenza virus infection. Peter's a huge advocate for evidence-based reality in areas as diverse as childhood vaccination, global hunger and anthropogenic climate change. And in an effort to communicate more broadly, he published 4 books for general readers. That's people like me. I put my hand up. And his latest is The Knowledge Wars. Here it is. Product placement. Laura Tingle is a political editor with the Australian Financial Review. She won the Paul Lynham Award for Excellence in Press Gallery Journalism in 2004 and the Walkley Awards in 2005 and 2011. In 2010 and 2013, she was shortlisted for the John Button Prize for Political Writing. Laura appears regularly on Radio National's Drive and ABC TV Insiders, and she's authored 2 quarterly essays, Great Expectations, and most recently, Political Amnesia, How We Forgot to Govern and Forgot to Bring Our Quarterly Essay with us. Lastly, but not leastly, Richard Denniss has spent 20 years moving between policy-focused roles in academia, federal politics and think tanks. He's the author of Econobabble, How to Decode Political Spin and Economic Nonsense. Here. He was until recently the head of the Australia Institute and is now its chief economist. He is also co-author of Affluenza, a book he hoped would make him a fortune, an introduction to Australian public policy and minority policy. It didn't though, did it? No. I'm still here. Still here. A regular columnist with the Australian Financial Review, the Canberra Times and the Monthly. So our 3 panellists come to this discussion from very different but very important viewpoints. Peter from a scientific approach, Laura from a political standpoint and Richard from an economic one. So I know that this is going to be a fascinating conversation over the next hour. Can I start with what has become my favourite word, econobabble? Because it makes so much sense when you talk about it, when you read your book, when you say that the primary purpose of econobabble that fills our airwaves is to keep ordinary Australians out of big debates about tax, fairness, climate change and the provision of essential services. What is it and how does it stop us from achieving a consensus on climate change?
Is that on? Yep. Look, I describe econobabble as 2 things. It's when we use complicated jargon to make a simple point. Most people in public debate aren't economists, no problem with that. Most people in Australia aren't economists, no problem with that. So why would non-economist politicians and non-economist citizens speak to each other through a language neither of them really speak? It's deliberate, it's designed to keep people out. When it comes to the economics of climate change, well, it's econobabble that killed it. In 2007, we had bipartisan political support for pricing pollution. John Howard went to the 2007 election supporting carbon pricing. At bipartisan political support, we had 70% community support, and by the time Kevin Rudd had finished talking about programmatic specificity and the minimum abatement cost and the need to compensate ETs, which other people thought of as emission-intensive trade-exposed companies, he kind of wrote a kick me sign on his arse and walked slowly past people who hated him for 3 years. And by the end of it, even he couldn't be bothered doing it. And to go back, in 2007, John Howard supported it, the public supported it, and the econobabble actually destroyed the public's interest in the issue, when all we had to do was make incremental steps towards something that we all agreed we wanted to do.
Would you agree with that, Laura?
Up to a point, Lord Copper.
I left out what the bad guys got up to.
Yes, well, I mean, yes, it was true that the conversation became much too complicated and the conversation became about how you did it rather than whether you should do it. But I was just reflecting on all this in advance of this discussion today, and in some ways it's the lack of an economic framework that I think has also damaged the debate. And the reason I'd say that is you may all remember Nicholas Stern, now Lord Stern of, Upper Frogmorton, Blathingman-Schmock or something, but he came out and did a lot of work for the Blair government or the Brown government, and said, look, the way we've got to think about this is really not about the cost of doing something, it's about the cost of not doing something. And I think this was an incredibly powerful message in a debate where there are a lot of obviously powerful vested interests and a bit of political inertia. It meant that you had both the sort of potent political image of all those poor polar bears, falling off the little tiny bits of ice that were disappearing at one end, people getting scared about really bad weather events that were happening at the time, but you also had this really powerful argument of saying, oh, well, actually there is a cost to not doing something. So I would agree that what all of that programmatic specificity language did was leave it open for somebody like Tony Abbott to come along and just say, it's a tax, it's a tax. And it's sort of interesting to me that nobody in the 2010 election was really talking about climate change. He occasionally would talk about a carbon tax as something that those evil Greens would do, but it wasn't something that really ever featured, which is why I think Julia Gillard was so sort of dismissive of it in that famous bit of footage just before the election. Well, that won't happen. It just wasn't there. So I think language can be incredibly potent, but I think you also have to look at those underlying structures of ideas and how they work as well.
And Peter, you urge people to be more informed about issues like climate change. How do you think our lack of knowledge is stopping us from achieving a collective will for action?
I'm not sure that's the main barrier. In fact, it's great actually listening to this because I lived in Canberra, if you can call it that, for 8 years. And I think I'm finally beginning to understand the place. If I spend a couple of hours with these guys, it never made sense to me, still doesn't. But the issue of climate change, I'm a biological scientist, a biomedical scientist. You say, what am I doing talking about climate change? Well, basically, it's if you look at the science of climate change, of course, it's all in the physical sciences. It's oceanographers and glaciologists and atmospheric physicists and all those sort of people who are telling us what's happening. But if you look at consequences are all in the biological sciences. We're not really worried about what happens to the goddamn rocks like the geologists. We're worried about what happens to life. And so it's trying to get this consciousness across, I think, that has become, I hope not too much an obsession, but I've been taking it very seriously. I've written actually 5 books so far, and in each of them I've written something about climate change. I tried to read up on it. I got caught up in when you're a Nobel Prize winner, you're supposed to know everything. And of course you don't, and you have an enormous capacity to make a fool of myself. Even if I open my mouth with the word economics, I automatically make a fool of myself. But I was getting a lot of questions about climate change. Sat down, wrote a book about it called A Light History of Hot Air, trying to read up on it. And then later I wrote another book called Sentinel Chickens, which looks at how birds monitor the world and how they're affected by issues like climate change and environmental degradation and all the rest of it. And I realised I'm sort of giving examples and trying to show people what's happening in various contexts. But then I'm talking about science, and it occurs to me that people don't really know what I'm talking about, because though we all study some science at some stage, I think very few people have much understanding of how it actually works. So this latest book is a book about science for non-scientists and people who hate science. It's got no big words in it. The biggest word in it was epistemology, but the editor took it out. There's no technical jargon in it. It's a warts and all. I tell you about fraud in science. I tell you about crooks in science. I tell you about skeptics, deniers. There's chapters on deliberate misinformation, and so it goes on. And what I'm asking people and trying to suggest to people is you can look at a lot of this stuff for yourself. Now a lot of the science literature is open access. Any of you can go online and read about half the scientific papers out there. But what the hell would you make of them? They're written in an arcane language. The structure is arcane. It's almost as bad as economics, except we have some data, which is conspicuously lacking in economics. I mean, most economists, I think, are not present company, except that are fantasists, quite frankly. So I'm trying to suggest you can look at it for yourself, even if you can't understand all the details. I think most of us have, especially if we're Australians, we have well-developed bullshit detectors. And there's a lot of bullshit out there. A lot of this is coming from the United States. It's coming from very big money. It's coming from things like the Heritage Foundation and all these institutions who are doing their utmost to ensure that the model for American capitalism, particularly for the fossil fuel industries, is not broken. They're putting disinformation out all the time. I think Abbott goes there for regular tutorials. Thank God we got rid of him. And what else can I say? Nothing.
Well, I'm glad we have Laura in between to keep you to a par for starters. So sorry about that, Laura. I didn't realise you were going to be the buffer. But as a scientist, Peter, what is your sense of Richard mentioned that 70% of people were behind putting a price on carbon. What's your sense as a scientist today in terms of what people feel about climate change and what they would like the governments to be doing?
I think the issue, I don't know how you feel about it in Perth, but it's pretty obvious. I think you're being affected by it. You're running 2 desalination plants. I was talking to a prominent Perth geologist last night, he was saying how the climate has changed. He grew up here. I mean, things are changing. It's happening. This isn't in the future. It's happening now, and it's probably been happening for some years. And yet, the problem is, I think it's such an enormous issue. It's the classical elephant in the room issue. It's so big, you can't really tackle it. And how do you tackle it? We all struggle with this. I mean, we may put solar on our roof, and that's going in the right direction. Now that batteries are coming in, that's something else we can do that will help. But, it really needs policy. It really needs not only national policy, it needs global policy. If you read, and apologies if I get this wrong, but if you read, say, The Economist, which is hardly a ratbag left journal, then you will see that a lot of economists think that the right thing to do is a carbon tax. And we had a carbon tax. It wasn't perfect. It was compromised in various ways, but it was the right thing to do. And what that would have done is put a framework for all of us, whether we're citizens or we're building buildings or creating industries and whatever. It would have put a framework for all of us that we could actually work to achieve a change. And that's really what we need. And a lot of countries are thinking about this a whole lot. I mean, China is thinking about it a lot. India. The US could be a catastrophe if we're unfortunate enough to get a Republican president. It could be a total catastrophe.
You were wanting to respond to
punching
bag.
I was going to say he's beating up my profession. Good on you.
He's not alone.
Look,
Sorry.
My profession will think whatever you pay us to think. Our job is to make the unpalatable and the inexplicable seem inevitable. That's what we do.
Scientists live in an oversimplified world. We design the rules for the experiment.
See, the world we invented.
And the world you live in, we're subject to human behaviour. You're subject to human behaviour.
No, we assume it all away.
And Laura's around politicians, so,
But no, let me disagree with something Peter said. Don't get me wrong, I think tackling climate change is an enormous problem that I'm very concerned about. I don't think it's nearly as hard as we tell ourselves it is. And I actually think that it kind of cheers people that want to tackle climate change up to tell themselves how big and hard it is, and the reason we're failing is because it's so big and hard. Well, let me choose my words carefully here. It's not that big or hard. Go back 50 years in Australia and think about what our transport system looks like, our communication system looked like, our schools. Pick anything from 50 years ago. And we've changed it fundamentally. Does anyone here remember photo development labs? All right. Do you remember the protests when digital cameras first came out, the save the jobs of the photo development lab workers?
No.
No, I missed them too, because we didn't care. Now, this is really important, because I care, and people who heard me speak earlier in the day will know that I actually think how we treat unemployed people is very important. But to be clear, the photo development industry was destroyed by a new technology. Does anyone remember video stores? All right, what about all the poor people that work in them? Goodbye, goodbye. When Jeff Kennett privatised Victoria's electricity system in the 90s, and these are numbers that I'm quoting because I know them to be true, more than 10,000 workers in the Latrobe Valley lost their jobs as the objective of government policy. And when 10,000 workers in the Latrobe Valley lost their job when the publicly owned electricity supply was sold to private owners who sacked a vast proportion of the workforce in order to lower their costs and make more money, the newspapers that raged against the carbon price applauded. Said that's the kind of drive and determination we need to tackle problems in this country. When a free trade agreement means that people lose their jobs, we say suck it up, it's called progress. When we cut protections in the manufacturing industry, we say suck it up, it's called free trade.
So why then are we so unwilling to take the job cuts here?
Because the political strategy of the people pushing for climate change policies is crap. No, let me just finish on this last point. Change is going to happen. People are going to lose their jobs. Enormous amounts of money are going to be made by people selling alternatives. This is not the biggest economic transformation we've ever seen. The internet destroys more jobs than climate change.
There's surely an enormous amount of money to be made out of renewables.
That's my point.
There's an enormous number of jobs in renewable energy.
That's my point, and we still lose.
But so why are we losing? It seems to me that's because the really big money is still invested in fossil fuels. Yeah. And these guys own the politicians.
And they're better at politics.
Let Laura respond to what you're saying.
Well, I suppose I don't sort of see it pragmatically. It's not as binary as that. I mean, if you look at what's happened in politics, I mean, I think there's a lot of questions of scale involved in this issue. You know, we've been talking about, people see it as really big and it isn't, and I think that's right. If you look at it at a political level, pollsters will tell you that the problem with the climate debate was in something of a sort of a different form of what you're talking about with econobabble, but that it sort of leapt the fence and became something that you were either unable to fix as an individual person or unable to understand as an individual person. So, people liked it when they said, I can get a light globe that's better, or I can put a solar panel on my roof. When it became something that the UN had to solve by a system that worked for the entire world, it became too hard. Now, are either of our sides of politics at the moment talking about this issue very much at the moment? No. But if you look at what happened in Paris, to me this sort of shows how, what both Peter and Richard are talking about is sort of happening by default. Copenhagen was a disaster because they wanted to have this big universal system. Now we've had Paris where people have made commitments. Now you can say they're not as great as they should be and everybody's going to do their own things. But I think realistically, the reality of the politics of this issue are that both the environment itself, and look at what's happened in China in particular, the pressures on the Chinese to actually sort this out have produced these phenomenal changes in technology.
I think it's worth you giving a little bit of history as well, because in your quarterly essay, the thing that I found so fascinating was how policy making has changed and the changes that have undergone in the public service in the last 30 years. And those changes might not be things that most of us think about from day to day, but But can you give us a little brief history lesson on those changes and how that they would be impacting on, you know, government's will or ability to come up with climate change policies?
Some sort of people see what I've written about as this sort of, you know, sentimental approach, like it wasn't as it was in the good old days, which isn't really what I'm saying. What I've talked about is how the institutions of our politics have morphed under the processes of deregulation, the media, all these sorts of things. One of the biggest institutional changes has been to the public service, and people talk about, you know, institutional change all the time, but what I was interested in was institutional memory. I thought, well, what is it that gives institutions their power and influence? It's what they remember. And when I say that, it's not just that it's what they remember as in, oh, this is what we did last year. It's in remembering all the various paths to getting an outcome. You know, it's in the politics of things. It's knowing how things were done differently, so that you've actually got a capacity to say to people, look, Minister, you've just arrived. We were here before. Your predecessor did this and it didn't work for the following reasons. So it's not just saying this is what we used to do in the olden days. It's really equipping the political process with a capacity to understand what's happened before. And I think in relation to climate change, I don't know that the public services role was particularly, you know, or its lack of institutional memory was particularly important in that particular regard. But I think the fact that it was so diminished by the time Kevin Rudd came along and sort of whirled through, that it meant that, you know, he would bombard from the top with all of this extra information, and I think the Rudd government spent so much time getting lost in the detail that they were unable to sort of rise up and sort of go, okay, what's the big picture here? What are the big political strategic questions we've got to do about our messages? They outsourced that, as everybody does, to sort of advertising people and marketing people and focus groups. So I suppose my argument is that everybody either outsources stuff or gets somebody else to do it for them, but the capacity of all of those individual arms of policy are not what they used to be.
Now, Peter, you and Richard both touched on, you know, the big money, the big business here that will be missing out. You know, oil and coal, particularly, they're multi-billion-dollar businesses. How influential do you see these sectors in terms of putting pressure on government?
I think they're massively influential. I mean, before the election where Abbott was elected, there was a meeting in the National Gallery in Melbourne where all these big miners, Rupert Murdoch and so forth, all came along, and they're all getting together with government. And if you look at the USA, I mean, the power, the reason that the Republican Party looks so totally insane from the outside is that they're all basically in the pocket of the Koch brothers and very, very big money. You know, we think of Murdoch as being sort of an evil bastard, but basically he's just one of their lapdogs. I mean, he's a minor guy. I mean, he's just their advertising agency. And that's another problem in Australia, of course. We've got these dreadful newspapers that lie and lie and lie. And so what do we do about it?
Not the Australian Financial
It's hard.
Review.
It's hard to get a message out there. I'm not talking about the Fairfax. I mean, if we lose Fairfax, we lose an enormous resource. I mean, where do we turn? I won't be buying a print newspaper at all if we lose the Fairfax organisation.
But I mean, if I can just butt in there, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying particularly about the media, but in some ways I think the much bigger issue for all of us in terms of messages is more the breaking down of the media. You know, the fact that you aren't confronted by ideas. You don't have to be confronted by ideas that you don't like anymore, or that you might find uncomfortable. Yes. You know, that you only get, you know, these sort of extremes of position on things. That is always going to be a much worse position than.
That's absolutely true, Laura. And of course, it's really encouraged by the nature of modern media. I mean, on the one hand, you know, I complain about media, but basically, as we're all aware, if we look, there's never been a time when we can get more access to really good information. through the web. But the problem is, of course, that's balanced by, there's never been a time that we can get access to more really bad information on the web. And also we're thinking in smaller clumps, if you like. I mean, we're thinking in terms of tweets, 140 characters. My agent, maybe it's because what I write is so boring, but my agent is trying to tell me to write no chapters. She wants anecdotes because people aren't reading more than 1,000 to 2,000 words at a time. I mean, the whole sort of culture of debate has been on the back foot. The ABC has been running scared. It's very obvious. I mean, they're under constant attack from the Murdoch media, and they were under fairly constant attack from the Parliament.
You're dying to say something, Richard.
Look, I am, and I agree with Peter entirely that wealth and power has got a big role to play in this. But think carefully about what I'm about to say. If we're actually waiting for the world's most powerful people to work with the world's media to deliver radical change that hurts both of them, we are going to lose. All right, so I could go all day on the distribution of income and what that does to political power. I could go all day on wouldn't it be good if rich people didn't own newspapers. But let's be clear, we start this game with a very unequal distribution of wealth and a very consolidated media. So putting them up as excuses for failure is not really helpful. Right, because we're going to lose kids if you feel good enough about complaining about that. The question is how, without wealth and power and our own media on our side, can we win? And history is full of examples where people have. So I come back to, if you are crap at political strategy, you will lose. All right, and communication is part of it, but communication is not a political strategy. It's a tool in one. I'll give you a specific example. The Australian Institute, and I've been having fun with this, some people here might know, we've been pushing for the world's craziest idea, Peter knows about it, a moratorium on building new coal mines. Because think about it, we're going to tackle climate change by burning less coal, but we need to build new coal mines. Seem a bit weird? Yeah, don't worry. Everyone says, oh, that's utopian and crazy. December 39, China announced a moratorium on building new coal mines. January 11, President Obama announced a moratorium on building new coal mines in American land. You know why? Political strategy. The owners of incumbent coal mines don't want new coal mines built. They're on our side. The oil and gas industry don't want new coal mines built. They're on our side. All right? If you're waiting for wealth and power and the media to join you in your campaign, you will lose. What are you going to do given that they're not on your side? That's an important question. And uniting left and right, whatever the hell that means, well, why not unite oil and gas and the owners of existing coal mines and people who want to tackle climate change in a coalition against the people that want to build new coal mines?
Is that something you could see happening, Laura?
Well, anything's possible these days.
It's already happening.
But, I mean, the interesting thing to me is if you look at Richard's book, my book, Peter's book, they're all in a way about ways of thinking about things. And, you know, what Peter's talking about a lot in that book is scientific method, and as he says, all the sort of colourful bits of it, which I found really fascinating. But, you know, one of my favourite books in my sort of brief and never quite completed university career was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
Yes, yeah.
And this is what I sort of, you know, these are the interesting bits of what my job are about. It's about how an idea just sort of sneaks through the process and everybody goes, no, that's not going to work. When we were talking before we came on about negative gearing and about how that suddenly it's okay after 30 years of being not okay. If you look back to that breakthrough moment in 2007 when John Howard, having gone no on climate change, suddenly went, okay, I'm going to lose the election, I'll do anything. I mean, those are the moments in politics, I think, where, once again, it's about being pragmatic and it's not about the left and right. I think I agree there. You know, it's about politicians doing what they do, which is, you know, looking for an opportunity, looking for a repackaging of what they're doing. And I think we've got this interesting position this year. I mean, you don't hear much about it. Labor is talking about an emissions trading scheme. Now, to most people in Australia, that means all of those initials and incomprehensible language that we had in 2007, 2009. It'd be a completely different vehicle to that. It'd be an Australian system. It wouldn't be an internationally part of an international system. The government has this combination of interesting policies, but they are ones that, with some morphing here and there, could actually end up being quite a good carbon price system. You have to morph it a bit, but it's not impossible. And I think this is where the interesting stage of this debate is going, that it won't be some spectacular breakthrough here, I don't think. But I don't think, with the demise of Tony Abbott, I don't think there is that huge divide there once was. Yes, there are lots of vested interests, but they're not... I don't think they're the ones who will actually determine what the political debate about this is in the next 12 to 18 months, which will be a crucial period.
Do you think, though, that people sort of expected a bit more from Malcolm Turnbull when he came in terms of on climate change and on gay marriage and those sorts of things? He seems to be in this sort of holding pattern at the moment of, not rocking the boat, and that may be, 5 prime ministers in 5 years, swinging voters, that, we seem to have this will to, oust leaders. So where do you think he stands? And will it become an issue at the next election that will be, both sides coming together?
Yeah. Look, people are very disappointed about Malcolm Turnbull. They had these great expectations for what he would be and how he would change things, and he'd send out secret smoke signals to us all to know to say, look, it's okay, I'm in charge, and he hasn't done that. He is incredibly constrained by the agreements he had to make with the Conservatives and the Nationals to get into office. His interest is in establishing enough, and the Conservatives aren't just going to go away. They're not all going to go, oh, okay, fair enough. I mean, Tony Abbott thinks he's coming back, for God's sake, So they're not going to go away. So his only real prospect is in establishing enough authority via his election win in that centre ground that people think, well, I'm just going to have to shut up and wear this for a while. And the premise at the moment is that whatever happens, the premise in Canberra I'm talking about, amongst politicians, the premise in Canberra is that Tony Abbott Malcolm Turnbull is going to win. Bill Shorten's got no hope, and as a result, that is affecting the behaviour of everybody on the Labor Party side and on the coalition side. But what do we know about the two sides' climate policies? We know that Labor has said it's going to have an emissions trading scheme, brackets, watch this space, and everybody sort of laughed about it at the time, but that was before Paris, and it was before you get that sense that there's this new feeling abroad that different countries are going to do different things, not as much as we'd like, but sort of heading in the right direction. And I think, given where Malcolm Turnbull has to get his electoral authority from, he's going to have to run either soft or, he's not going to be running against climate policy. So what you have to hope for is that, he wins and he has enough space as a result to start morphing that policy. And people within the bureaucracy talk about, what they can do with just doing this, this and this to actually make the emissions reduction fund and various other things a reasonably viable policy. It's not ideal, no suggestion it is, but it's not, we're talking about degrees rather than, not at all.
Yeah. You seem to feel as though we as people need to do more for ourselves in terms of pushing this issue onto the agenda and making it something that politicians actually, have to do something about. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, look, everyone's got their role, but, to be clear, most politicians are followers, not leaders, and when they're under enormous pressure from powerful vested interests to not do something, and all they can hear from the crowd is crickets, then they're less likely to invest their political capital to take a risk pushing for it. The econobabble comes in when the powerful groups are kind of shouting down ordinary Australians by talking in a language that ordinary Australians can't talk back. And when politicians facilitate that by saying, yes, the language of debate is least cost abatement and the impact on Edie's, well, it's not like the crowd are going to rise up and say, I'm on the side of the stuff I didn't understand there.
I think people are fearful, though, as well of, you know, this idea that it'll ruin our economy.
Yeah,
And you know, you say the biggest and most cynical hoax of modern political life is the assertion that tackling climate change will be expensive and harmful to the economy. How do you argue against that when that's what we continuously hear?
Yeah, it's a complete hoax to suggest that solving a harmful problem is expensive. You just work backwards. I mean, this is what Stern was saying. Look at the enormous cost of doing nothing. If you do nothing, here are all the bad things that will happen, and we're focusing on the cost of the immunisation rather than on the premature death that comes from the illness. So, you know, it was, don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of politics. It was political genius to turn this debate around. You know, really, conservatives. What does the word conservative mean? Keep things the way they are. Who are the group that are the most likely to say, climate change, let's just suck it and see, eh? Who knows what's going to happen in the next 50 years? But as a conservative, I'm a roll the dice kind of guy.
Well, you talk about this in your book, Peter, as well. Yeah. This, you know, the left and the right, and the idea that, you know, that the basis of science is bad or politically left.
It isn't, you know, this didn't start out as a left-right debate. No. Basically, you had both the left and the right, say, of US politics, as we were discussing earlier for Australian politics. You had both the left and the right aligned to do something about it. But what has happened in the US is the rise of libertarian politics. And basically, this is basically a political movement. The conservative American commentator who died not so long back, William F. Buckley Jr., called it, he's a conservative, he called libertarianism anarcho-totalitarianism. And what libertarianism is about is abolishing all regulation, abolishing taxes, decreasing the size of government. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Okay? This is the crap rhetoric we're getting from our politicians. And basically, this is what the very rich, the ultra-rich want, and this is why they're pouring money into this in the United States. There's almost no limit on the amount of money they can put in because of the regulations that the Supreme Court essentially dismantled recently. So as this libertarian movement goes on, their basic objection to doing something about climate change may not necessarily be that they're heavily vested in the coal industry. Their objection is it requires regulation, it requires taxes, it actually requires governments to do something. And that's their really basic philosophical objection to it. That's why they describe action on climate change as a vast left-wing conspiracy. They probably see Malcolm Turnbull as a raging communist. I mean...
just very quickly, I agree with everything you said, except that the best patsy doesn't know they're a patsy. And the so-called libertarians that are so angry about climate change in the US are sitting back watching the nation state introduce incredible powers of surveillance over their citizens.
Oh, of course.
No, so my point is, if they were sincere libertarians, I would respect them far more. Like, these are strategic libertarians. I call them glibbertarians. Right? They're the libertarians with this glib kind of, I care about freedom, comma, when it's good for the political power that pays me, and the minute that, you know, other freedoms, that's not my wheelhouse, I'll let that one slide. So I agree that the people breathing it and front it in America probably actually believe they're being libertarian, but they are funded to talk about libertarianism and its impact on public health, public education and climate, and they can't get money from the Koch brothers to talk about libertarianism and its impact on defence spending, the security apparatus or anything else. They believe it.
It wouldn't be too surprising if the Koch brothers don't have big investments in whatever's required to make the surveillance state
This is
work.
my point. The people fronting the libertarian campaign might think they're sincere libertarians.
Yeah.
They are only aimed at public health, public education and climate change. Their libertarianism vanishes on the right side of the ledger.
Laura, what's your take on the influence of big business and of these guys keep talking about people with money and the influence they had in comparison to the collective will of the nation, if that's what people really want?
Well, I mean, the most spectacular example of that power, of course, was during the mining tax debate, which I found staggering. Just watching them at work when they really sort of set their mind to something. Of course, the great irony a few of us snigger about is that if they'd actually left the mining tax in place, now, don't get me wrong, there were flaws in the mining tax, but if they'd left it in place, we would currently be paying miners because the commodity prices have fallen so much. But, and instead we've got people sort of talking about bailout packages for the mining industry in Queensland. Anyway, I'm digressing. So yes, they can be incredibly powerful, politics is an ugly game, and they do get a lot of influence. But I would sort of argue, in my sort of experience, and I'd go back to 2007, and I always sort of date it to there was a documentary. I remember writing a piece about it. There was a documentary on the ABC which had the polar bear, on the little bit of ice and their little baby. Oh, it was so sad. So there was that on the ABC, and then I think John Howard was addressing the nation on 60 Minutes or something about why they weren't going to do anything on climate change. And I actually rang up and asked the various television stations what the ratings were. Well, everybody was watching the polar bear, it was about the time when he actually realised that people were alarmed. They wanted the government to do something. And, always back self-interest. Politicians will do what they think they need to do to get voted in. And that ultimately is the ballot box. So, what you're saying about making yourselves heard is absolutely right. The thing that's sort of bad about climate change is it's one of those issues, like Indigenous affairs being another much more spectacular example, that's just fallen off the edge.
Why has that happened, though? Have we backed off? Have people backed off from speaking out about it? Are there other things we're worried about more? Do we just distrust our government to do anything about it anyway? What do you think's happened?
Well, things fall off the political stage from time to time because both sides are agreeing about it, because other things are taking up all the oxygen, because neither side wants to talk about it. There's a whole range of reasons why that happens. It's unfortunately the case that in the last 10 years in particular, the debate has been so binary. It's been so when the coalition wants to talk about the budget, they immediately go, it's all Labor's fault, it's all Labor taxes, and it's the same on the opposite side. I mean, my only real hope for Malcolm Turnbull is that he doesn't quite use that language and that methodology, and so it creates a little bit more room for people to actually talk about what the issue is rather than just attacking the other side. So a range of reasons why it's fallen off, but once again, climate change rose up out of nowhere in 2006, 2007, and Labor sort of embraced it because it saw it. Self-interest said there is an opportunity here to look different from John Howard, to look more modern, and it's one of those sort of coming together of a range of factors which just give something zoom.
Mm. I think with the point about actually getting some action, I think a lot of it's going to come bottom up. And I think one of the things that's going to start driving it is batteries. I think solar and batteries. And if the government doesn't foster that, people will start going off the grid, which is going to create enormous problems for the electricity suppliers. But on the other hand, if they go with it and they foster it, this could be a lot of our future generation. They'll need to build more grid because of the variation across the country. But this is the way I think it will go, and I think it will start to work that way. I mean, the point earlier about, things just happen and we just change. I mean, look at the internet. The ultimate disruptive technology. It's cost enormous numbers of jobs. It just sneaked up on anyone. If people had realised what was happening with the internet, you would have had just as much opposition as you did to climate change action. But, if people had realised what was happening with the internet, you would have had exactly the same level of opposition because it has massive effects. But they didn't. It's a disruptive technology that just came through. And what we need in this whole area is really disruptive technologies. And I think that the primary disruptive technology is going to be electricity storage and home batteries and so forth.
I want to let people have an opportunity to ask questions, but did you want to make a point?
Oh, look, I agree. But again, the internet, yes, it kind of snuck up on us. But what we need our politicians to do, if they actually want to help us solve problems over time and help us introduce policy over time, is admit some really simple truths to people. Like, every month in Australia, 350,000 people change jobs.
Yes.
Every month, 350,000 people change jobs. And when we hear that putting a carbon tax on might lead to 20,000 miners losing their jobs over the next 20 years, it's not even rounding error. But the newspapers run the 20,000 jobs will go, and no one puts it into context. No one says out of 24 million people, over the next 20 years, let me tell you, there's going to be a lot of change. And a vanishingly trivial proportion of that will be related to this carbon price that we've introduced today. No one ever told you that. We keep saying it's big and radical. It's not. But it's just a policy.
It's not it's a certain control of the media that keeps saying
our debate has put it up on a pedestal where people love it or hate it.
Yeah.
And if you actually want to unite left and right about it, you've got to put it into context. It's rounding error at the employment level.
I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask Peter and Laura and Richard a question. So if you pop your hand up, and I'll get a microphone to you. This lady down here. Thanks, Di.
You say that we have allowed the debate to slip away from us and go into... But, sorry, isn't it that what they've done is exactly what the tobacco industry did and prevented the connection? It was said at the time, all we have to do is introduce doubt in terms of scientific data. And they seem to have the same tactics.
Yeah, there's a book on it by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway called Merchants of Doubt.
Yes.
That actually goes through. It's a very good book because it looks at evidence. It makes the case very calmly. The objection to action on climate change came from exactly the same people who tried to stop action on cigarette smoking, who tried to stop action on acid rain, the ozone layer. It's the same people and the same strategies that are being used.
Yes.
I agree, but that's why we should be winning, because it's the same people and the same strategy. And who do we blame for not predicting the inevitable? Of course the tobacco companies will push for tobacco and create doubt. Of course the coal industry will do the same. Frankly, the fact that the book has been written is proof of how bad the strategists on the other side are. It's that transparent, and we're losing.
We'll move on so other people have a chance. This gentleman over here, Di, if we could get to... Thank you. And if you could just ask your question and who you would like to answer, it would be great.
It's to the panel. The question is about, I think, the dinosaur in the room rather than the elephant in the room. We've all agreed that corporations have far more power than we understood that they should. They don't vote. They're not on the electoral roll. Only we citizens are. Why do we let them have any influence when they don't exist electorally? Could you answer that?
Laura, do you want to have a go at that?
Well, we allow them to have influence because of money, and there've been attempts to clean up the electoral donations laws, which are pretty, the electoral donations laws are pretty abysmal in terms of declarations and everything else, and there is, it's the polite edge of corruption, or not so polite edge of corruption in our political system that there is so much money and thus so much vested interest in the political parties in keeping the laws the way they are.
Yeah, I mean, there's an enormous amount in our society and in most societies that is corrupt, but it's not illegal. And that's a fact. And basically the way they work is they create fear, they emphasise how much this is going to affect you. We saw the great big new tax. That's the strategy, and they've got the money to put that out there. And it's up to us to inform ourselves and try and stand up to them. And that's, I guess, the best we can do is try and get people to look.
I agree entirely. I just add to that, apart from the money just buys them much better access than you and I could ever get. The politicians then voluntarily hand over. It's terrible. They're not even getting a good price for it. They give it away for free. The access is cheap. The windfall profits our politicians hand them are enormous. But I guess I'd add self-servedly perhaps that the econobabble is central to it. The way that you scare the hell out of 20 million people. If we have a carbon price, sure, we'll tackle climate change and your kid will lose their job. Right? Until people call bullshit on that, we're going to keep losing.
Anyone else? Lots of people. Di, do you want to go to this in the 4th or 5th row? Yep, the gentleman there, please.
Thank you. This is a really interesting discussion, and I like what the panelists are all saying. I'm with an organisation called Citizens Climate Lobby, which we believe that we have perhaps a small part of the solution, which is to getting the political will to address the problem. And to add to that, we're suggesting a fee and dividend, which is essentially a tax on carbon, but the entire tax collected is repaid as a dividend to the public. I don't know whether the panel have heard of that and whether they would like to comment on the option.
Look, yeah, I just can't see how you'd ever win votes taking money off rich people and sharing it around. Sounds like political suicide to me. Look, again, this highlights the point earlier, this idea that tackling climate change will cost us heaps. No, it'll cost people that make a fortune out of the status quo heaps. You can, I've got no conceptual problem with what you've described. I could come up with half a dozen ways that would basically redistribute a lot of money that have made a lot of windfall profits over the years to those of us who own the natural resources that are being burned to cause climate change. It's entirely politically palatable, except that our political class either don't want to do it or lack the communication skill to sell it.
Over here, if you'd like to stand up, lady there with the, yep. So Di can find you. Thank you.
Thanks. You talk about the community informing itself about these issues and taking action, but how do you combat legislation such as what's being introduced by the Barnett government on anti-protest laws?
Do you know about that? That's a recent, yep.
Yeah, look, Tasmania introduced similar laws to prevent protests against forestry. Where are the libertarians? Yeah. Right? That's how you win that fight. You highlight the rank hypocrisy of alleged libertarians. Where was our Freedom Commissioner when this stuff is going through Parliament? I mean, you're going to need to accumulate political power and scrutiny outside of your state. But this is the point. This is the hypocrisy that's being laid out here. People are just making up laws that deliver what they want, and they cherry-pick philosophies and economic policies whenever.
I actually think the libertarian viewpoint is pretty alien to the way most Australians think. I mean, we expect certain things from government. Libertarianism is much closer to the way Americans think. They've got this myth. We all have myths. You know, we have the myth of the fair go. The American myth is freedom. New Hampshire, live free or die, or live free and die. But, you know, that's not our myth. Our myth is we expect government to provide us with decent health care and decent public education. We expect government to provide us with decent public education and decent healthcare. Most Australians expect that. That's not a libertarian point of view, that's a collectivist point of view.
I love that you're being heckled because they want to hear what you have to say, as opposed to being heckled because of what you're saying. So I think that's something that you can be very pleased with this afternoon. Try and take one more question here. Di, do you want to just go? Yep, thank you.
Thank you. We can't control our economy. We can't control our population growth. Are you seriously suggesting that globally we can control the Earth's climate? Thank you.
Peter?
I think it's an enormous challenge, as you very correctly point out. I think there is a dynamic going, but just how effective it will be is another question. But the only thing I would say to you is we have to try. I mean, there's no alternative. We have to try.
And I don't know, is it about controlling the climate? I don't know that it is about controlling the climate. I think it's about controlling or modifying behaviour. I mean, it's not like we're starting here and we're sort of ending up here. It's about modifying at the margins, you know, the way we're using our resources and the way we use, the way we travel or whatever, in a way so that we're not, you know, making things worse. I don't think it's about controlling the climate because, well, we can't.
Look, exactly. It's not about control, and the only thing we need to control is potentially ourselves. We've never been in charge of the climate. We never will. But we are, in a democracy, we are in charge collectively of the decisions we make. And if we want to increase burning fossil fuels, if we want to do that, then we will contribute, according to the science, we will contribute to making the world a more dangerous place. And we can blame everyone in the world for that. We can blame the Koch brothers or Murdoch, but ultimately, collectively, no one's stopping us from stopping ourselves.
A very quick final word.
Well, I think it really is about what we value. And really, we need to put in place that what we value most is the long-term sustainability of life on our planet. And if we start thinking in those terms, we will start acting in ways that ensure that happens. So if we put that at the front of our value system, then we will change.
This is a conversation that could go on and on, and it's difficult to wrap something like this up, but hopefully we've given you food for thought this afternoon. I'd encourage you to do some more of your own research, and one of the ways you can do that is any of the books that our guests have written. Peter Doherty, Knowledge Wars, Laura Tingle and her quarterly essay, Political Amnesia, and Econobabble by Richard Denniss. All of them are very easy to read. I can personally attest to that. Please thank our guests this afternoon. Thank you.